The morning sun painted the ancient streets of Kyoto in golden hues as David stepped off the train. At Jinshiyo Station, his backpack felt heavy on his shoulders, not from the weight of his belongings, but from the excitement of finally being in Japan, after months of saving every penny from his job at a tech company in Seattle. He had made it. This was his dream trip, and he was doing it completely alone. David had always been the type of person who helped others without thinking twice about it. Back home, he was the guy who would stop to help someone change a flat tire or carry groceries for elderly neighbors. It wasn't something he did for recognition. It was just who he was. His friends often joked that he had been born with a helper's instinct that he couldn't turn off, even if he tried. Walking through the narrow streets of Jin, David felt like he had stepped into a different world. Traditional wooden buildings lined the pathways, their dark timber frames creating beautiful shadows in the morning light. Cherry blossom petals drifted down like pink snow, and the sound of his footsteps on the stone path seemed to echo through centuries of history. He had been wandering for about an hour when something caught his eye. Tucked between two larger buildings was a small tea house that looked like it had been there forever. The wooden sign hanging outside was written in beautiful Japanese characters that he couldn't read. But something about the place drew him in. Maybe it was the way the morning light filtered through the traditional paper screens, or the gentle sound of water trickling from a small bamboo fountain near the entrance. As David approached the tea house, he noticed a young woman struggling near the side entrance. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, wearing a simple but elegant kimono in soft blue tones. Her dark hair was pulled back in a traditional style, and she was trying to manage several large wooden boxes that seemed too heavy for her to handle alone. The boxes appeared to be antique, with intricate carvings on their surfaces. They looked important, almost sacred in a way that David couldn't quite understand. The woman was clearly having difficulty lifting one box only to have another slip from her grasp. She would bow apologetically to the boxes each time this happened, as if she was sorry for not treating them with proper respect. David's helper instinct kicked in immediately. Without even thinking about cultural differences or language barriers, he approached the woman with a friendly smile and gestured toward the boxes. He pointed to himself and then to the boxes, using the universal language of helpfulness that he hoped would translate across cultures. The woman looked up at him with surprise in her eyes. For a moment, she seemed uncertain, glancing between David and the boxes as if she was trying to make an important decision. Then, something in her expression changed. Her eyes widened slightly, and a soft blush colored her cheeks. She bowed deeply, much more formally than her earlier apologetic bows to the boxes. "Arigato gozaimasu," she said softly, her voice carrying a note of something that David couldn't quite identify. Gratitude. Certainly. But there was something else there too, something that seemed much deeper than simple thankfulness for a helpful gesture. Together, they began carrying the boxes into the tea house. David was amazed by how heavy they were, filled with what appeared to be traditional tea ceremony equipment. Each piece looked like it had been crafted by skilled artisans generations ago. There were beautiful ceramic bowls, delicate bamboo whisks, iron kettles with intricate designs, and wooden scoops that had been polished smooth by countless hands. As they worked together, David became aware that they were being watched. An elderly woman had appeared at the entrance to the tea house, her silver hair arranged in a traditional style, and her keen eyes taking in every detail of what was happening. She was clearly the woman's grandmother or perhaps the owner of the establishment. Her face was lined with years of wisdom, and when she looked at David, he felt as though she was seeing something that he himself didn't understand. The elderly woman said something in rapid Japanese to the younger woman, who responded with what sounded like excitement mixed with nervousness. They spoke in hushed tones, glancing at David with expressions that seemed to hold some sort of significance he couldn't grasp. When they finished carrying all the boxes inside, the young woman bowed to David again, this time even more formally than before. She gestured toward a low table near a window overlooking a small garden, indicating that he should sit. David wasn't sure if this was just polite hospitality or something more formal, but he accepted the invitation. What happened next took his breath away. The woman began preparing tea with a level of ceremony and precision that David had never witnessed before. Every movement seemed deliberate and meaningful. She heated water in an iron kettle, the sound creating a gentle melody that filled the quiet space. She cleaned each utensil with careful attention, arranged items on the table with mathematical precision, and moved with a grace that seemed almost like a dance. The elderly woman watched this entire process with growing interest, occasionally nodding with approval or whispering something that made the younger woman's cheeks grow pink again. David found himself mesmerized by the ritual, completely unaware that his simple act of helpfulness had set in motion something far more significant than he could have imagined. The tea ceremony took nearly an hour, and throughout the entire process, David felt like he was witnessing something sacred. The young woman would occasionally glance at him with an expression that seemed to hold hope, nervousness, and joy all at the same time. When she finally presented him with the bowl of tea, she did so with both hands and another deep bow, her eyes meeting his for just a moment before looking down respectfully. The tea was unlike anything David had ever tasted. It was slightly bitter but somehow perfectly balanced, with a richness that seemed to warm him from the inside out. As he drank, he noticed that both women were watching him with intense focus, as if his reaction to the tea was incredibly important. When he finished, David tried to express his gratitude in the few Japanese words he knew. Oishi, he said, hoping he was pronouncing it correctly to convey that the tea was delicious. The reaction this simple word caused was immediate and profound. The young woman's face lit up with pure joy, and the elderly woman began speaking rapidly in Japanese, her voice filled with what sounded like celebration. David left the tea house that day with a warm feeling in his heart and a business card, with the address written in both Japanese and English. He had no idea that his simple gesture of helpfulness had been interpreted as something much more significant in this traditional culture, or that the two women were already planning what they believed would be his return as something far more important than just a tourist seeking good tea. As he walked back through the streets of Jin, cherry blossoms continuing to fall around him like blessings, David felt a strange pull to return to that little tea house. He told himself it was just because of the incredible tea ceremony he had witnessed, but deep down, he knew it was something more. There had been something special about that place, about those women, and about the way such a simple act of kindness had created a moment of connection that transcended language and cultural barriers. David woke up the next morning with the taste of that incredible tea still lingering in his memory. He had planned to visit the famous Kinkakuji temple that day, but something kept pulling his thoughts back to the small tea house tucked away in those quiet streets. He told himself it was just curiosity about Japanese culture, but deep down, he knew there was something more drawing him back. After grabbing a quick breakfast from a convenience store, David found himself walking the same path through Jin District. The morning was crisp and clear, and the cherry blossoms seemed even more beautiful than the day before. Local shopkeepers were opening their stores, sweeping the sidewalks with careful attention to detail that David was beginning to recognize as distinctly Japanese. When he arrived at the tea house, David noticed something different immediately. The elderly woman was waiting outside, almost as if she had been expecting him. Her face broke into a warm smile when she saw him approaching, and she bowed respectfully before ushering him inside with gestures that seemed more formal than simple hospitality. Inside, the tea house had been transformed. Fresh flowers had been arranged in a beautiful display near the window, and the entire space seemed to glow with extra care and attention. The young woman from yesterday appeared from behind a screen, and David was struck by how different she looked. Her kimono today was more elaborate, with delicate patterns of cranes and flowers embroidered in gold thread. Her hair was arranged in an even more formal style, with ornamental pins that caught the morning light. When she saw David, her entire face lit up with joy. She bowed deeply, much deeper than she had the day before, and when she straightened up, there was something in her eyes that David couldn't quite understand. It looked like happiness mixed with nervousness, the way someone might look when something very important was about to happen. The elderly woman said something in Japanese, and the young woman nodded eagerly before disappearing into what appeared to be a preparation area. David could hear the gentle sounds of tea ceremony preparations beginning. But today it seemed different somehow, more elaborate, more special. While he waited, David tried to communicate with the elderly woman using a combination of hand gestures. In his phone's translation app, she seemed delighted by his attempts to speak Japanese, correcting his pronunciation with patient smiles and encouraging nods. Through the app, he learned that her name was Grandmother Tanaka, and that the tea house had been in her family for over 100 years. When the young woman returned, David was amazed by what he saw. She was carrying a tea set that looked like it belonged in a museum. The bowls were clearly antique, with glazes that had been perfected by master craftsmen centuries ago. The bamboo whisk looked like it had been carved by someone who understood the art. At the deepest level, even the cloth she used to clean the utensils appeared to be made of the finest silk. The tea ceremony that followed was unlike anything David had experienced the day before. Every movement was even more precise, more meaningful. The young woman would occasionally glance at him with an expression that seemed to ask if he understood the significance of what was happening. David found himself nodding and smiling, trying to show his appreciation for what he assumed was exceptional hospitality toward a foreign visitor. As she prepared the tea, David noticed that Grandmother Tanaka was watching everything with intense focus. She would occasionally make small comments in Japanese that caused the young woman to blush or adjust her technique slightly. At one point, the elderly woman left the room and returned with what appeared to be a camera, taking several photos of the ceremony with David and the young woman in the frame. The tea itself was extraordinary. It was made from what was clearly the finest matcha powder, whisked to a perfect consistency that created a foam so delicate it looked like green silk. When the young woman presented it to him, she did so with both hands in a bow so formal that David felt like he was receiving something sacred. As David drank the tea, he became aware that they had gained an audience. Throughout the morning, various people had been quietly entering the tea house. First came a middle-aged woman who looked like she might be the young woman's mother, based on their similar features. Then an elderly man in traditional clothing who seemed to be someone important in the community. Finally, several younger women who appeared to be around the same age as his tea ceremony host. All of these visitors were watching the ceremony with expressions of joy and excitement that David couldn't understand. They would whisper among themselves, occasionally giggling or nodding with approval. Some of them took photos with their phones, always making sure to include both David and the young woman in the frame. The strangest part was how they all seemed to know exactly who David was. They would bow to him with the same formal respect they showed to Grandmother Tanaka, and several of them approached him with small gifts. One woman brought him a beautifully wrapped package that contained traditional Japanese sweets. Another presented him with a small ceramic figure that appeared to be a symbol of good luck. Through his translation app, David tried to understand what was happening. The responses he got were confusing and seemed to involve words like celebration, blessing, and future happiness. When he asked why everyone was being so kind to a tourist, the responses became even more puzzling, with references to honor, family, and destiny. The young woman seemed to glow with happiness throughout all of this. She would serve tea to each visitor with the same careful attention she had shown David. But there was something different in her manner when she served him. Her movements were softer, more personal. When she looked at him, there was a warmth in her eyes that seemed to suggest something much deeper than polite hospitality. As the day progressed, David found himself completely enchanted by the atmosphere. The tea house felt like the center of some kind of joyful celebration. Though he couldn't understand what was being celebrated, everyone treated him like he was someone special, someone important. It was flattering and confusing at the same time. When afternoon began to fade into evening, the visitors started to leave, each one bowing formally to David and saying words that his translation app suggested meant something like congratulations or best wishes. The young woman walked each person to the door, accepting their bows and comments with gracious smiles and what appeared to be expressions of gratitude. Finally, it was just David, the young woman, and grandmother Tanaka again. The elderly woman approached David with a serious expression and began speaking in careful, slow Japanese while pointing to her phone's translation app. The message that appeared on the screen made David's heart race with confusion. Tomorrow, we prepare for family meeting. You bring honor to our house. David left the tea house that evening with his head spinning with questions. What family meeting? What honor? Why did everyone seem to think he was someone more important than just a tourist who had helped carry some boxes? As he walked back through the now familiar streets of Jin, cherry blossoms falling around him in the twilight, David couldn't shake the feeling that he had somehow become part of something much bigger than he understood. The warm feeling in his chest had grown stronger, and he realized that his attraction to this place went far beyond curiosity about Japanese culture. There was something about the young woman's smile, about grandmother Tanaka's knowing looks, about the way everyone had treated him like family, that made him want to understand what was really happening. Tomorrow, he decided, he would find a way to get some real answers. David barely slept that night. His mind kept racing with questions about what was happening at the tea house. He had come to Japan for a simple vacation, but somehow he had gotten caught up in something that felt much bigger and more important than sightseeing. The way everyone had looked at him, the formal ceremonies, the gifts, the photos, none of it made sense for how people typically treated tourists. The next morning, David received a message on his phone from a number he didn't recognize. When he opened his translation app, the message read, "Honorable guest. Please come to tea house at sunset. Important family gathering awaits. Dress respectfully." Tanaka family. David's stomach fluttered with nervous excitement. He had packed only casual clothes for his trip, but he found the nicest shirt and pants he had brought and made sure everything was clean and pressed. Something told him that whatever was happening tonight was going to be significant. As the sun began to set over Kyoto, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, David made his way through the now familiar streets to the tea house. But when he arrived, he could hardly believe what he saw. The small building had been transformed into something that looked like a venue for a very important celebration. Paper lanterns hung from every available space, casting a warm glow over the entrance. Fresh flowers had been arranged in elaborate displays, and he could see through the windows that the interior was filled with people. Not just a few visitors, like the day before, but what appeared to be an entire extended family. Grandmother Tanaka met him at the door, dressed in her finest kimono. The fabric was deep purple with intricate silver patterns, and David could tell it was something very special, probably reserved for the most important occasions. She bowed formally and welcomed him with words that his translation app couldn't quite capture, but her tone conveyed deep respect and honor. Inside, David was amazed by what he saw. The tea house had been arranged with low tables forming a large rectangle, and at least 20 people were seated around them. There were elderly, grandparents, parents, aunts, and uncles, and several young people who appeared to be cousins. Everyone was dressed in their finest clothing, and when David entered, they all turned to look at him with expressions of joy and anticipation. The young woman from the tea ceremonies was there too, seated in a place of honor at the head of one of the tables. She was wearing the most beautiful kimono David had ever seen, deep red silk with gold embroidery that seemed to tell a story in its patterns. Her hair was arranged in an elaborate style with ornamental combs that looked like family heirlooms. When she saw David, her face glowed with happiness. But there was also something else there, nervousness, hope, and what looked like deep affection. An elderly man, who appeared to be the family patriarch, stood up and began speaking in formal Japanese. His voice carried the weight of tradition and ceremony, and everyone listened with respectful attention. David could catch a few words through his translation app, something about honor, blessing, future, and happiness, but the full meaning escaped him as the speech continued. David became increasingly aware that he was the focus of everyone's attention, People would glance at him and nod approvingly or smile warmly in his direction. Several family members took photos that included both him and the young woman, always positioning them together in the frame. Then came the gifts, one by one. Family members approached David with beautifully wrapped presents. There was a silk scarf that felt incredibly expensive, a wooden box containing what appeared to be traditional writing brushes, a ceramic teacup that looked like it had been made by a master craftsman, and several other items that seemed valuable for casual gift giving. The most significant moment came when the young woman approached him, with a package wrapped in the most elegant paper David had ever seen. Inside was a tea set that took his breath away. The ceramics were clearly antique, with glazes that seemed to capture light and hold it. The bamboo whisk was perfectly crafted, and the wooden scoop had been polished to a shine that spoke of generations of care. As she presented the gift, the young woman spoke softly in Japanese, her eyes meeting David's with an intensity that made his heart race. Even though he couldn't understand her words, the emotion behind them was unmistakable. This wasn't just a gift, it was something deeply meaningful, something that carried the weight of tradition and family history. The evening continued with elaborate courses of food that David had never experienced before. Each dish was a work of art, presented with the same attention to ceremony that he had observed in the tea preparations. Family members would toast him with sake, raising their cups with words that sounded like blessings and good wishes. As the evening progressed, David became increasingly uncomfortable with his confusion. Everyone was treating him like he was someone incredibly important to the family, but he had no idea why. The weight of their expectations and the formality of the occasion made him feel like he was missing something crucial. Finally, a young man who had been quiet for most of the evening approached David. He introduced himself in careful English as Kenji, a cousin who had studied abroad. David's relief at finding someone who could communicate directly was enormous. "Excuse me," David said quietly, pulling Kenji aside. "I need to ask you something important. Why is everyone being so kind to me? I'm just a tourist who helped carry some boxes." Kenji looked at him with surprise, then confusion, then something that looked like dawning realization. He spoke quickly in Japanese to several family members, and David watched as expressions of shock and bewilderment spread around the room. "Oh no," Kenji said, turning back to David with wide eyes. "I think there has been a very big misunderstanding." David's stomach dropped. "What kind of misunderstanding?" Kenji took a deep breath. "In our traditional culture, when a man helps a woman carry the sacred tea ceremony tools, especially the way you did, it is seen as a proposal of marriage. Everyone here believes that you asked Ayako to marry you and that she accepted." The world seemed to stop spinning. David stared at Kenji, then at the young woman, Ayako, who was watching their conversation with growing concern. Around the room, family members were beginning to realize that something was wrong. "A marriage proposal," David whispered, "but I was just trying to help." "Yes," Kenji said sadly, "but in our culture, touching the sacred implements together is one of the most serious romantic gestures possible. Ayako and her family have spent the last 3 days preparing for your engagement celebration." David looked around the room at all the happy faces, at the elaborate preparations, at Ayako's beautiful kimono and hopeful expression. His heart broke as he realized that his simple act of kindness had created expectations and hopes that he couldn't fulfill. These wonderful people had opened their hearts and their family to him based on a cultural misunderstanding that was entirely his fault for not knowing better. The weight of the moment settled over him like a heavy blanket. He had accidentally proposed to a woman he barely knew, in a culture he didn't understand. And now he had to figure out how to handle the situation without breaking hearts or insulting a family that had shown him nothing but kindness and honor. The silence in the tea house felt like it lasted forever. David could feel 20 pairs of eyes watching him as the reality of the situation sank in. Ayako's face had gone pale, and her hands were trembling slightly as she held the precious tea set she had just given him. Grandmother Tanaka looked between David and Kenji with growing concern, clearly sensing that something had gone terribly wrong with their celebration. David's first instinct was to run, every fiber of his being wanted to apologize quickly and escape this impossible situation. He imagined himself grabbing his backpack from the hotel and catching the next flight back to Seattle, leaving this beautiful family to deal with the embarrassment he had accidentally caused. But as he looked around the room at all the effort that had gone into this evening, the decorations, the elaborate meal, the expensive gifts, the formal clothing, David realized that running away would be the most cowardly and hurtful thing he could do. These people had welcomed him into their family based on what they believed was a sincere commitment. They deserved better than a tourist who disappeared in the night. Taking a deep breath, David stood up slowly. The room fell completely silent as everyone waited to see what he would do. Through Kenji, David began to speak, his voice shaking. With emotion, "Please tell everyone that I am deeply sorry," he said, looking directly at Ayako as Kenji translated. "I had no idea that my actions meant what they meant in your culture. I was only trying to be helpful because that's what my parents taught me to do. I never intended to mislead anyone or cause any confusion," as Kenji translated. David watched the family's faces change from confusion to understanding to what looked like disappointment. Ayako's eyes filled with tears, though she tried to maintain her composure. Grandmother Tanaka closed her eyes for a moment, as if processing this unexpected turn of events. But David continued, surprising himself with what he was about to say. "I need you all to know that these past 3 days have been the most amazing days of my entire life." The family looked up with renewed attention as Kenji translated this unexpected continuation. "I came to Japan as a tourist, expecting to see temples and take photos and eat good food," David said, his voice growing stronger. "But instead, I found something I never expected to find. I found people who welcomed a complete stranger like family. I found traditions so beautiful they made me want to cry. I found kindness that I didn't know still existed in the world." David turned to look directly at Ayako, who was watching him with surprise and something that might have been hope. "And I found a woman whose grace and kindness touched my heart in ways I didn't know were possible," he continued. "I may have helped carry those boxes by accident, but everything I've felt since then has been completely real." The room stirred with whispered conversations as family members discussed this unexpected development. Grandmother Tanaka stood up and approached David, studying his face with the same intense attention she had shown from the beginning. She spoke quietly in Japanese, and Kenji translated. She asked if you were saying that even though you didn't mean to propose, you might want to get to know Ayako better as a person, not as a cultural obligation. David felt his heart racing as he considered the question. Was he really thinking about this? 3 days ago, he had been a single software engineer from Seattle with no serious relationships and no plans beyond a 2-week vacation. Now he was standing in a traditional Japanese tea house, surrounded by a family who had accepted him as one of their own, looking at a woman who had somehow captured his imagination completely. "Yes," he said finally, the word coming out stronger and more certain than he had expected. "That's exactly what I'm saying." The reaction was immediate and electric. Family members began talking excitedly among themselves, and David could see smiles returning to faces that had looked disappointed just moments before. Ayako's tears changed from sadness to what looked like joy mixed with amazement. "Grandmother." Tanaka clapped her hands once, commanding attention from everyone in the room. She spoke in rapid Japanese, gesturing between David and Ayako, and David could hear the word chants repeated several times in Kenji's translation. "She says that maybe the universe has a sense of humor," Kenji explained with a grin. "Maybe you were meant to help carry those boxes, even if you didn't know what it meant. She says that real love stories often begin with misunderstandings that turn into something beautiful." Over the next hour, the atmosphere in the tea house completely transformed. What had started as an embarrassing cultural mistake became something entirely different, the chance for two people from completely different worlds to discover if their accidental connection might become something real. David learned that Ayako spoke more English than she had let on, but had been too nervous and overwhelmed by the formal situation to use it. When she finally spoke to him directly, her voice was soft but clear. I was scared when Kenji explained. The misunderstanding, she admitted. But I was also scared that you would leave and I would never see you again. These 3 days. Watching you experience our traditions, seeing how kind you are to my family, it made me want to know who you really are. David felt something shift in his chest. A warmth that had nothing to do with cultural obligations or accidental proposals. I want to know who you are too, he said simply. Not because of any ceremony or tradition, but because something about you makes me feel like I've been looking for you my whole life without knowing it. The family began making plans immediately. David's original departure date was still 5 days away, but they insisted he spend that time properly getting to know Ayako and learning about their culture with full understanding. Rather than confusion, they would take walks through Kyoto together, visit temples and gardens, and have real conversations about their lives, their dreams, and their differences. David called his boss that night and used vacation days he had been saving for years to extend his trip by another week. For the first time in his adult life, he was doing something completely spontaneous and potentially crazy. But as he fell asleep in his small hotel room, thinking about Ayako's smile and the way her family had turned a disaster into an opportunity, David realized that the best things in life might be the ones you never see coming. The next morning, when he met Ayako at a small cafe near the tea house, she was wearing a simple dress instead of a kimono, and her hair was down round her shoulders. She looked younger, more relaxed, and somehow even more beautiful than she had during all the formal ceremonies. So, she said with a shy smile as they sat down with their coffee, "Would you like to start over? My name is Ayako, and I teach tea ceremony to tourists and business people who want to understand Japanese culture." David laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. "Nice to meet you, Ayako. I'm David, and I'm a software engineer from Seattle, who apparently has a lot to learn about cultural sensitivity." As they began talking, really talking, without ceremonies or misunderstandings or family expectations, David realized that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the biggest mistakes. 6 months had passed since David returned to Seattle, and not a single day went by without him thinking about Kyoto. What had started as daily video calls with Ayako had grown into something deeper than either of them had expected. They would talk for hours about everything and nothing: her work teaching tea ceremony, his projects at the software company, their favorite foods, their childhood memories, their dreams for the future. David had thrown himself into learning Japanese with the same intensity he usually reserved for coding projects. He attended classes 3 nights a week, practiced with language apps during his lunch breaks, and even joined a local Japanese cultural society where he learned about traditions, etiquette, and history. The more he learned, the more he understood how significant his accidental proposal had been, and how graciously Ayako's family had handled the entire situation. Meanwhile, Ayako had been studying English with renewed enthusiasm. Her messages to David had evolved from simple, careful sentences to long, thoughtful paragraphs that revealed her personality in ways that had been impossible. During their first meetings, she told him about her childhood growing up in the tea house, her dreams of traveling the world to share Japanese culture, and her fears about whether someone from such a different background could truly understand her way of life. Their relationship had developed slowly and carefully, built on genuine friendship and mutual respect rather than cultural confusion. They shared photos of their daily lives, sent each other care packages filled with local treats, and slowly began to feel like they knew each other as real people rather than romantic ideas. David had been planning his return trip for months, saving every penny and coordinating with his work schedule to take 3 weeks off. This time, he wanted to do everything right. He had studied Japanese customs around courtship and dating, learned about proper gift-giving etiquette, and even practiced formal greetings until they felt natural. The morning of his departure, David's hands shook as he packed the carefully chosen gifts he had brought for Ayako's family. There were artisanal chocolates from a famous Seattle chocolatier for grandmother Tanaka, a beautiful coffee table book about the Pacific Northwest for Ayako's parents, and a handcrafted wooden box made by a local artist for Ayako herself. When David's plane landed in Osaka, his heart was racing with excitement and nerves. This trip felt completely different from his first visit. He wasn't a confused tourist stumbling into cultural misunderstandings anymore. He was a man who had spent months preparing to properly court a woman. He had fallen in love with across an ocean. Ayako met him at the airport, and David's breath caught when he saw her. She was wearing a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes, and her smile was radiant with joy. When they hugged, it felt like coming home after a long journey. "Welcome back to Japan," she said in English that had improved dramatically since their first meeting. "I miss you more than I thought possible." "I miss you too," David replied in carefully practiced Japanese, making Ayako laugh with delight at his pronunciation. The first week of David's visit was spent simply enjoying each other's company without the pressure of ceremonies or family expectations. They explored Kyoto together like the tourists they had never had a chance to be. They visited temples and gardens, tried street food from vendors, and spent hours walking through neighborhoods that Ayako had grown up in. David was amazed by how natural everything felt. Despite their different backgrounds, they had similar senses of humor, shared values about family and tradition, and complemented each other in ways that felt effortless. Ayako loved David's enthusiasm for learning and his genuine respect for Japanese culture. David was enchanted by Ayako's grace, her wisdom about life, and her ability to find beauty in small, everyday moments. During the second week, David began spending time at the tea house again, but this time as a serious student rather than an accidental participant. Ayako taught him the proper way to participate in tea ceremony, explaining the philosophy behind each movement and the history of each implement. David approached the learning with the same dedication he brought to everything important in his life. Grandmother Tanaka watched these lessons with growing approval. She could see that David's interest in their culture was genuine and deep, not just a romantic gesture to impress Ayako. She began teaching him things that were usually reserved for family members, special techniques passed down through generations, stories about the tea house's history, and traditions that weren't written in any textbook. One evening, as David was practicing the tea ceremony under Grandmother Tanaka's watchful eye, she stopped in mid-movement and spoke in rapid Japanese. Ayako translated, her voice filled with emotion. She says you have learned not just the movements, but the spirit behind them. She says that when someone truly understands the tea ceremony, they understand something important about finding peace and creating beauty in the world. David felt tears spring to his eyes at the unexpected praise. Over the past months, the tea ceremony had become more than just a way to connect with Ayako's culture. It had become a form of meditation that brought him peace and helped him slow down his usually fast-paced life. As his third week in Japan began, David knew it was time to have the conversation he had been preparing for since his first day back. He asked Ayako to join him for a walk in the same garden where they had first talked as friends, rather than as products of cultural misunderstanding. Ayako, he began, his heart pounding as he switched to Japanese for the important words he had been practicing. 6 months ago, I accidentally asked you to marry me without knowing what I was doing. Today, I want to ask you something with full knowledge and intention. Ayako's eyes widened as she realized what was happening. I want to ask if you would consider building a life with me. David continued, pulling out the wooden box he had brought from Seattle. Inside was a ring he had designed himself, incorporating both American and Japanese elements in its design. Not because of any cultural tradition or family expectation, but because I love you. I love your kindness, your wisdom, your strength, and the way you make me want to be a better person every single day. Ayako was crying now, but her smile was brighter than any David had ever seen. I love you too, she said, switching between English and Japanese in her excitement. I love how you learned our language and our customs not to impress me, but because you wanted to understand my world. I love how you treat my family with respect and my grandmother like she's your own. I love how you make me laugh and how you see beauty in things I thought were ordinary. When David slipped the ring onto her finger, it felt nothing like his accidental proposal 6 months earlier. This time, he knew exactly what he was doing and exactly how much it meant. The wedding planning took another year, with David making several trips back and forth between Seattle and Kyoto. They decided to have the ceremonies, a traditional Japanese wedding, at the tea house for Yako's family and friends, followed by an American celebration in Seattle for David's side. The Japanese ceremony was everything David had dreamed it would be. Wearing traditional wedding kimono, he and Ayako performed a tea ceremony together using the same implements that had started their story. When they carefully handled the sacred tools together this time, every movement was intentional and filled with love. David's family flew in from Seattle, and they were embraced by Yako's relatives with the same warmth that had characterized that first confusing evening. Cultural differences that had once seemed impossible to bridge became opportunities for learning and connection. Now, 3 years later, David and Ayako split their time between Seattle and Kyoto, running an international business that teaches tea ceremony and cross-cultural communication to companies and individuals. Their story has become something of a legend in their Kyoto neighborhood, and they often share it with couples who are navigating their own cross-cultural relationships. David never did become the traditional tourist he had planned to be on that first trip to Japan. Instead, he became something much better, a husband, a bridge between cultures, and a living example of how the most beautiful love stories can begin with the most unexpected misunderstandings. Sometimes, he reflects, the best proposals are the ones you make twice, once by accident and once with all your heart.